All right, let's go ahead and get started. I think this is about all we're going to get today. Some of you are in quarantine. Some of you are in springtime summer mode. And like we were just talking about, this is a pretty short chapter. Hopefully, like Sita mentioned, you found it an interesting one. But I think we can just dive right in and get going. And then maybe we'll be able to call it early, start our weekend a little early. So who wants to get us going? Who wants to summarize chapter 1 for us? And that feels a little weird talking about a chapter 1 so late in the semester. But I think we're going to find that it's kind of cool that we put it off until so late. So who wants to talk about this chapter? Yeah, Kaya. Yeah, excellent summary. Renee, was that a hand or a stretch? Okay, so yeah, this is a chapter about pre-pregnancy. And if you are planning on conceiving, there's already some data-driven decisions that we need to take into consideration. Certainly, when is an important question, and also, like Kaya mentioned, we can talk about maternal weight as well. Let's start with that age question, because I think that was sort of an interesting one. Who wants to dive into that question a little further? What did Oster find? Yeah, Sita. Right, so Annika, is that a hand or a stretch? Okay, yeah, so what we saw was that fertility declines with maternal age, and we start to see these declines at age 35. What can we learn from these data? Yeah, Lily. Yeah, it's really interesting because we spent Monday talking about regression discontinuity, and we spent Monday talking about what cutoff variables look like and how we can learn from cutoff variables. In maternal age, when we think about it in sort of popular terms or colloquial terms, we tend to think about this cutoff. We tend to think about like, oh, well, you should conceive young. We know that there are chromosomal implications for conceiving at older ages. But when we look at the data, we don't see a steep cutoff. We see, like Lily described, this sort of slow decline. Like, yeah, fertility might go down, but there's no real difference between being 34 and 36. And we see this decline not just slow, but also gradual. We also see something else, which is people still conceive at older ages and conceive quite successfully. So how might we push back against these data? Certainly there's stuff we can learn from these data. How might we push back against them? And to answer that question, maybe we want to think about what are the studies she's citing? Who remembers what she said? Yeah, a lot of the data are really old. Yeah, Cami. Yeah. Lily just said that. I apologize if I didn't repeat it for people in the back. No, don't. But yeah, some of the data are really old. Some of the data are from the 1800s. We might push back against this concept of maternal age declining or maternal fertility declining with age because some of the data are really old. Now, I bring this up because I'm worried that we've spent a lot of this semester pushing back on data. And certainly that's our job. We are leaders in this world. It's our job to be appropriately skeptical. It's our job to push back against data. But data can also be quite compelling. So why might it be okay that the data and that these studies are so old? Yeah, Cami. Yeah, excellent point. So one of the reasons we're not particularly concerned with data from the 1800s is pregnancy, for the most part, is the same as it always was. And in fact, what we're going to see on Monday when we talk about partial identification is, if anything, we've gotten better at having babies. We have advanced medical technology, we have cesarean sections, we have epidurals, we have all these things that in vitro, which he mentions in the chapter, which make it easier to be fertile at advanced ages. So if the question is, can one still conceive past the age of 35, data from the 1800s only serve as proof of concept. And if anything, our advanced medical technology makes it easier than someone in the 1800s had it. Why else might data from the 1800s be compelling? What else can we learn from these data? Yeah, Lily. Yeah, excellent point. There were fewer birth control methods back then, and certainly fewer accurate and reliable birth control methods back then. So, like we said, pregnancy is still more or less the same. There might be better medicines to rely on. There might be IVF or there might be epidurals. But for the most part, you have a fertilized egg that comes to term and then is born. For the most part, pregnancy is the same. But when we look at these, let's call them classic or vintage data, we don't have these alternative explanations of maybe people are using better or more advanced birth control techniques. So we have pretty compelling data on what fertility might look like. And again, I'm underscoring might, because certainly times have changed, and certainly outside factors have changed, like people wanting to delay pregnancy for life goals, or people not wanting to have kids at all, which is more socially acceptable, or any number of reasons. But if we're looking at proof of concept, we know that conception is possible at advanced maternal ages. And to that point, but perhaps phrased differently, conception is not impossible at advanced maternal ages, even when we get into the 40s and mid-40s. Indeed, though some of the studies are from the 1800s, we have more modern studies as well, and our contemporary data are actually quite similar to our vintage and classic data, which should point in the direction that we know actually quite a lot about age of conception and maternal age and fertility. Questions so far? Now, we also talk in this chapter about maternal weight. Who wants to remind us what she's saying in this chapter? Or in this part of the chapter, I should say. Yeah, Cami. Yeah, Cami. And Renee, I saw a hand a second ago. Yeah, and you in the middle. And remind me of your name, I'm so sorry. Okay. Right, so we're concerned with pregnancy weight, we're concerned with how it affects fertility, we're concerned with complications, we're concerned not just with small changes in weight, but large changes in weight. Sita, I think I saw a hand. Did you want to add to that? Yeah, and beyond fertility, these complications look like preeclampsia, they look like gestational diabetes, there are some other things that we don't have to go into right now. Again, this is not a class on pregnancy, this is a class on data. This is not a class on medical science, this is a class on data. But we can associate these data, maternal weight, maternal BMI, with some of these outcomes. So you get at a really interesting point, which Oster mentions, which is a lot of the times, and again, one of the things that I think is really cool about this book is comparing our sort of conventional wisdom to what the data are actually telling us. And a lot of the times in our conventional wisdom and in our conversations and colloquially, we talk about weight gain during the pregnancy. And certainly it's something that reasonably stands out in our mind. People tend to gain a lot of weight during the pregnancy in part because there's a thing growing inside them. But I find it really interesting that when you dig into the data and you dig into what the doctors are telling you, the concern is not so much weight gain during the pregnancy. People tend to gain weight at similar rates. It's weight in advance of conception, which, Sita, you were talking about a second ago. And really the concern with these birth outcomes and with these complications is, Lily, to your point, maternal BMI before you even conceive. So what do you guys think about that? Thoughts, questions, concerns? All right, so like I said, this was a really short chapter. It's important for us to look at the data. It's important for us to critique the data. But more broadly than that, what did you guys think of this chapter? Sita, before class started, you said you thought it was really interesting. Do you mind diving into that a little bit? You certainly don't have to.
I thought that was an interesting way to start the book. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, conception, that totally makes sense. But I think after reading all of these other chapters first, I guess I thought that it was like an interesting pairing of topics for the first chapter.
Yeah, great point. Anyone else? What do you guys think of this chapter, Renee? Yeah, and to your point, on writing style, and when we talk about data, it's not our job to critique writing style so much, but it is something that's worth considering sometimes is, for the most part, I read this book like a data book. But this one, perhaps because of tone, perhaps because of subject matter, felt a little bit more like a self-help book or an advice book and less like a data book. And maybe that was just my subjective experience. But yeah, I do think it's sort of interesting compared to some of the other and perhaps later chapters that we read. Lily, you had a hand.
Well, personally, I think with the whole age thing, I like how she did it on obviously you have to take into account like socially things are a lot more different. Like people are gonna get pregnant older because they want, dreams and jobs and aspirations and all of that. And it's a different time zone than, the 1800s when basically they were just getting pregnant all the time. There was birth control or like family planning practices going on. And I like how she didn't make it seem like you should be getting pregnant younger if you want to have more kids and stuff like that, because she wasn't trying to focus on, you want to start your family early or else you're not going to have kids. It wasn't like this scared kind of thing.
Right, excellent point. And you hinted something we talked about earlier, and I want to get back to, which is one of the ways we look at the vintage data, the 1800s data, is just time of marriage, because marriage was highly correlated with conception back then, and it's not now. Now, this might also be a place in which we push back against the book's narrative, right? Emily Oster is an Ivy League professor from a family of Ivy League professors, wealthy, white, more or less in shape. Certainly her goals when it comes to conception and her experience when it comes to conception is going to be different than a lot of the rest of the public. And as we see in the chapters on birth, most of us are not giving birth at Brown-Annenberg Hospital, right? So while it's really cool to hear her normalize delaying pregnancy, and while I think that's really important, it might also be important to push back on people who don't necessarily have some of the freedom and say, career goals that she has. Lily T. Yeah, excellent point. It's really funny that, funny, not ha-ha funny, but funny, interesting, that we have this, conception of age as a cutoff in our everyday conversation, but not so much for BMI. Not the way we talk to one another, and not the way the book talks about it. And we can think of a couple different reasons why this might happen, right? Everyone knows their age. But I certainly, off the top of my head, don't know my BMI. I have a sense of what range I'm in because I know my weight and I know my height, but I'm not running that long division mentally. Age is also, as she mentions in the book, somewhat out of our control. It's going to keep ticking forward. Whereas BMI might be a little bit more controllable. We might be able to do things to manage our weight, at least in narrow bands. Which, to your point, I think drives us back to one of the things that the Bergstrom-West book was telling us about, particularly in the chapter on counting. When these things become targets, they cease to become good measures. And she talks about this experience with her own weight, how her lowest adult weight that she had ever had was leading up to her wedding. And that's because she had 5 cardio workouts at 5:30 in the morning a week. But is that an accurate reflection of what Emily Oster looks like on a typical Tuesday? No, it's this ideal weight that she really strove for during this, important event in her life. And if people planning their pregnancies, go on, say, crash diets or crash exercise plans before they conceive, that might be problematic in and of itself. What about the rest of you? Thoughts on the chapter? Annika. Yeah, and a lot of you have talked about this in your biweekly essays. For anyone who didn't hear, it's really interesting to come back to the start of the book where there is a lot more data from which we can make our decision. And part of that is, ease of data collection. It's really easy to look at a medical record and say, you were 38 when you conceived. It's not as easy to say, you consulted with 2 doulas and a midwife. So some of it is just ease of collecting the data, ease of interpreting the data. But some of it really has this more sort of like, let's say, objective stance than some of the later chapters. Excellent point. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think of this chapter? Do you guys like or dislike this chapter? Yeah, Renee. Mm-hmm. Kaya? Right. Cami?
I agree. Heard that it was really interesting, the steps that go into planning a pregnancy, but also, I don't think I would have continued to read the book if I would have read this chapter first. Like, I kind of would have questioned almost like where her data was coming from, just because she claims to like be an economist, but we don't really get to see as much heavy data as we do in like
Right, excellent point. I should say it's not that she claims to be an economist; she is an economist, and actually a quite good one. We wouldn't be reading the book if she were a charlatan, or at least we would be critiquing it in a different way. What about the rest of you? What do you guys think of this chapter? So who took some big lessons away from this chapter? Yeah, Sita.
That sometimes studies and data are valid even if they're really old, or at least not necessarily valid, but useful.
Yeah, I really enjoyed thinking about how data can be compelling. And certainly we spend a lot of this semester talking about ways in which data aren't compelling. Flawed studies, perverse incentives, missing data, researcher degrees of freedom, lots of different ways in which data might not be compelling. And I thought it was really refreshing to think about, here's a study from the 1800s where the data are still reasonably compelling. And it's our job as leaders to think about why that might be the case. And here, because the mechanics of pregnancy are more or less the same as they were 250 years ago. What about the rest of you? What other big lessons did you take away from this chapter? Yeah, Renee. Okay, so maybe this chapter sparks some sort of like evolutionary questions in us. And we can, using what we know about data, critique why that might be the case, or think about why that might be the case. We have longer gestational periods than other species. So data from the 1800s aren't that long ago for us generationally. They'd be very long ago generationally for, say, bacteria. We've already seen so many different variants of the COVID virus. We can think about ways in which evolution might not be biological. So though our reproductive systems haven't changed that much since 1800, our social systems have. And we see human evolution on that scale, where people are conceiving later and perhaps getting married later, or not tying conception to marriage the way they did back then, and lots of other things where if we think about evolution more broadly or more holistically, we do see the species evolving, though it happens on a social and technological standpoint rather than a biological one. Excellent point. Yeah, Lily.
Yeah, I think that's like what I took away from it, that we've evolved like socially and with our like medical practices, because technically if I wanted to, I could freeze my eggs and then have kids when I'm like 40s or like older, when it may be a little bit harder to have kids, whether how fertile I am or not. I can still decide to have kids later when in general maybe like in the 1800s it wouldn't be the case because they didn't have access to the same medical practices that we have today with freezing our eggs and surrogacy and stuff like that.
Yeah, excellent point. An excellent way of describing it from a technological standpoint. We can also describe delayed, let's say family planning from a social standpoint, where it would be easier for you to adopt now, or find a way of forming a family, whether that family involves kids or not, in a way that it wasn't in 1800. Excellent point. What about the rest of you? Any thoughts on the chapter? Any big lessons you took away? Cool, so like I said, this was a really short chapter, and we try and get out of here a little early on Fridays anyway. But does anyone have anything that they want to share before we end class? Since we didn't do our usual questions, comments, concerns before we got started. All right, so let's wrap it up for now. Monday we're talking about partial identification, which I think is a really cool extension of this chapter, right? Because what partial identification says is we might not have to know the causal effect, but maybe we can bound it. Don't forget to check Canvas for the instructions for essay number 6. They've changed for the better, no need to worry. Anyone who's celebrating Passover this weekend, have a good one. Enjoy the weather, stay safe. We're in an outbreak right now, so stay distanced to the extent you can, and don't forget to exit through the side doors.